Boa tarde a todos, eu sou o Thiago.
Hello, everyone. My name is Thiago Nogueira. I coordinate the photography, contemporary photography area at the Instituto Moreira Salles, and I am the editor of ZUM magazine that is being launched its new issue with this festival. It is a pleasure to open this third panel of our festival with a very interesting presentation. We began on Monday, our festival, and we will finish on Friday. We have two other tables or panels after this one. This festival celebrates the launch of the print version of the ZUM magazine. This is our 10th anniversary this year. We have many interesting topics about photography and audiovisual. Today, to speak to you, we have here with us British artist, filmmaker, professor, a man of many talents, Isaac Julien. He has made an exhibition in Brazil. I don't know if you've seen this. It was in São Paulo in 2013. There was a retrospective of his work. Isaac produces in different medias. He uses film, installation, photography. And he, in the end of the 80s, he made a film about Langston Hughes' work, the film Looking for Langston. It had the participation of Stuart Hall, a very important thinker, a very important partner for Isaac as well. And besides Looking for Langston, he has made other very important films. One of his films about François Non, a Martinique thinker, a very important activist. And now his work is being published in Brazil in Portuguese. Isaac recently also looked into Brazilian architect Lina Bobardi, and there is now the world premiere of a film and an installation called Marvelous Entanglement about Lina Bobardi's work. But today he will be speaking to us about Lessons of the Hour. It's a film and it's a visual installation. It's from 2019, and it's about former slave and abolitionist Frederick Douglass, a very important person in US history and also in world history. Recently, well, he's actually, Frederick Douglass is the topic of a major installation in the art biennial right now in São Paulo. He became a great speaker and a great activist for abolitionism in the US. He was also very much interested in photography. Legend says that he was the most photographed man in the US in the 19th century. Several of his self-portraits are now being exhibited in the art biennial in São Paulo. And it's an interesting opportunity to get to know Frederick Douglass. Well, first of all, I wanted to thank Isaac. Thank you for being here with us. Isaac is going to introduce his work. This is a work that is not in Brazil yet, and now it's a new layer to this work. He's publishing a book. I saw the book when we met recently in London. And Isaac is going to make a 40-minute presentation, more or less, explaining about his work, Frederick Douglass' story, and the connections with his work. And then we will open up from some questions from the audience. If you have any comments or questions about Isaac's work or about Frederick Douglass. Isaac, I do see you on screen, and it's a pleasure to have you here with us. Thank you very much for being here at the festival. It's really important to be celebrating the 10th anniversary of our magazine with your presence. So I wanted to give you the floor now, and we may begin the conversation. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much for your kind introduction. It's a great pleasure to be able to talk to you about the making of Lessons of the Hour this evening. I'm talking to you here from London, and of course, as was stated earlier on, I am quite familiar to a certain extent with Brazilian culture, with the making of my film on Lina Bobardi, A Marvelous Entanglement. And today I'm going to be talking to you about a sister project to that work, which is Lessons of the Hour, which is a sort of portrait of Frederick Douglass. But before I do that, I thought it would be great for you to maybe see some trailers of the work. just to give you a bit of an idea about the film. So the first trailer is a single screen trailer of the work, but the work was originally made as a 10-screen work. I'm probably going to be talking to you about that 10-screen work and the process into making that this evening with you. But you'll see 2 clips, hopefully from the 10 screen, from an installation of the work at the McAvoy Foundation for the Arts in San Francisco. And they will give you an idea of Douglass's relationship to photography, and of course, his famous speech, "What to the slave is 4th of July." So if we could show those clips, it'd be fantastic. And then I'll present my paper. Thank you.
Conscience itself is misdirected, shocked by delightful sounds, beautiful colors, and graceful movements. It sleeps amid the 10,000 agonies of war and slavery. And your thanksgivings, with all your religious parade and solemnity, are to him mere bombast, fraud, deception, impiety, and hypocrisy. A thin veil to cover up crimes which would disgrace a nation of savages. There is not a nation on earth guilty of practices more shocking and bloody than are the people in these United States in this very hour. I have now my manumission papers in my possession. There is nothing that will sting the Americans more than the fact I left Republican America a slave. I returned from monarchical England, a free man. There is not a nation on earth guilty of practices more shocking and bloody than are the people in these United States in this very hour.
Thank you. So you've seen these two clips from Lessons of the Hour, which gives you an idea of how the work's installed as a 10-screen work, and the single screen is a trailer, so it gives you a little bit more information in relationship to the images. So the Lessons of the Hour project began with the commission by the Memorial Art Gallery in Rochester, part of the University of Rochester in upstate New York, in March 2016. I was going on a trip with John Hanhart, the exemplary video media curator. We were visiting a number of sites. We went to the park where Frederick Douglass statue is now located, and I felt then that there was a possibility for trying to grapple with some of the ongoing questions which have come to surface in the past couple of years through Douglass's writing. I thought that in his text, lectures, and speeches, there exists a way in what he spoke about, gave a historical lineage to all the current debates which we have been involved in ourselves in the recent years and decades, from post-coloniality to issues around race and representation, and of course, to a current debate around Black Lives Matter. As I thought about Douglass, I also realized that the main attribute which relates his life to my work was involvement with the archive and the desire to investigate the archive to articulate contemporary concerns. However, I was not a Douglass scholar. I didn't know a lot about Frederick Douglass at the time, but that actually inspired me to do proper research that took around 3 years. As in my other works, I wanted to avoid the narrative and poetic limitations of linearity and to present Douglass through a heterochronic framework. As we know, there are a host of debates which we are familiar with, which explore the notion and the question around realism, questions around the linearity of films in terms of narration and narrative, and around all the ways in which they underpin, in ideological sense, fixed responses from spectators when they begin to look at works in the film arena. I've always wanted to question the dominant forms of filmmaking, and I think that the question really for me begins around the idea of what is truth. And Foucault's idea of the regime of truth, in which I was always very involved with. As Foucault states, there are different versions of truth. And how to quote from Foucault, truth, he says, is a thing of this world. It is produced only by virtue of multiple forms of constraint, and it induces regular effects of power. Each society has its regime of truth, its general politics of truth. That is, the types of discourse which it accepts and makes function as true, the mechanisms and instances which enable one to distinguish true and false statements, and procedures accorded value in the acquisition of truth, the status of those who are charged with saying what counts as true. End of quote. And I'm sure this quote has some bearing on the Brazilian situation, as it does here in England, and as it did in America with Trump and his foes. I think there's an aesthetic challenge of how to present information, stories, or histories in order to signify that they can be more open-ended. What tends to happen with the realist documentary mode of making works of this nature is that these sorts of themes and concerns is that there is a linear progression, and through it one gets the resolving of questions of which one is trying to pose. All of this felt very formulaic, and it was something that my generation wanted to contest. Once I applied these strategies to the materials which were connected to Frederick Douglass' archive that I came across, with the help of Celeste Barnier, I was able to, in a sense, percolate and make rearticulations, both of how we would connect to Douglass in the contemporaneous or in the present moment, and also look at the historical trajectory. And what I wanted to do was to match these different times in the work. What I was trying to achieve aesthetically and formally in Lessons of the Hour, but also politically and culturally, is this effect of the movement that resonates with current actions. I'm interested in Frederick Douglass as an activist, but an activism that is not just connected to forms of activism that we are familiar with, but also to the fact that he was interested in photography, in art, in social justice, and challenging these dominant forms himself, as he did in quite an encyclopedic manner with his interest in Shakespeare and in language and power. The form of making multiple screen works developed out of a unique scenario of making moving image works in a gallery context. It was initially an alibi as to why one would want to show or works in a gallery as opposed to cinema space or indeed television, or now on social media platforms. But it was really about the idea of experimentation that one could afford in those spaces. And then there's the aesthetic drive in terms of multi-layering and visual alliterations that one could construct through parallel montage, through the sequencing of cross-cutting and editing across several screens simultaneously. Of course, there are lots of theories of cinema which I've been involved in relationship to the visual language of making moving images, and some of them which go right back to Eisensteinian concepts of working with the montage of attraction, and the idea that one would want to create a third meaning based on Roland Barthes' concept. As we know, using Eisenstein film stills, Barthes analysis 3 orders of meaning: the informational, the symbolic, and the signified. the emotion value. And it's this third one that I am interested in exploring in these multiple screen works. The multiple screen works first enabled one to develop a practice where I could work with the interplay of narrative, space, temporality connected to theories around spectatorship and the gaze. Those ideas related to the way in which the technologies have refashioned how we look at things today. By that, I mean the way we look at and view images, which are not all for the good, I would argue, is very different from an analog generation. The digital revolution that we have all been involved in, I argue, creates a kind of political aesthetic reaction, such as an opposition to the surveillance capitalism in my work, and enables one to create a critical, self-reflexive language. Also, there's an element in relation to the politics and poetics of working with time. If we look at my earlier work, for example, one can see how time and temporal representations are being questioned. The way that one would make the connection between two distinctive moments and suture those together was something I wanted to explore. In the multiple screen works, I was able to bring different versions of Douglass, as in the photography, and to play with time at the same time. For example, this occurs at the end of Lessons of the Hour, when in Douglass' speech, What to the Slaves the 4th of July, created in the 19th century, is juxtaposed to resonate at the beginning of the 21st century, with FBI surveillance imagery filmed during the Freddie Gray uprisings in Baltimore, which took place just a couple of streets away where Frederick Douglass had lived in Baltimore in the 19th century. The visual juxtaposition, the use of parallel montage editing techniques creates a visual topographic mapping which one can construct new readings of such political events through recourse utilizing a choreography of different visual elements punctuated by, in this instance, reversed fireworks. This opens a possibility, I'd argue, of enhancing various possible readings and interpretations which can be brought to bear on the current political moment, creating a kind of echo chamber of visual iterations from which a more nuanced response to these questions which Douglass posed 2 centuries ago. When making the film and making images, we are working with considerable details in terms of art direction, decor, costumes, cinematography, production design, and archival text. We want all those to resonate in a poetic manner, following direct lines of argument in Douglass's work in relationship to art, photography, citizenship, as ways of assessing and critiquing a certain apparatus and media that Douglass and his family were involved in, such as the production of the North Star, newspapers, his lecture tours, his almost encyclopedic self-portraiture in photography, which led him to be the most photographed person in the Americas of the 19th century. All of these things are inseparable from his interest in language. I was also interested in Frederick Douglass as an activist who explored the dehumanization of slavery in speeches and in texts in which the human-animal relationship was of critical significance. In his times, horses were mostly treated far superior to enslaved persons. As a scholar, Warren Critchlow points out, quote, "The figure of the horse is a trope that Douglass mobilizes in lectures throughout his lifetime, a rhetorical device to which he turns in both jest and in exacting seriousness to confront the slave's abjection in the world of human relationships, and most notably in contradiction to any semblance of natural rights possessed by Enlightenment society, along with its Christian values." In my work, I therefore created an image of Douglass that we might not be familiar with, beside a horse, not riding it, at one with nature, etc. In his 1845 autobiography, Douglass signals the proximity of the horse to consciousness about his slave's human condition by saying, quote, "By far the larger part of slaves known as little of their ages as horses know of theirs, and it is the wish of most masters, within my knowledge, to keep the slaves thus ignorant," end quote. And later he continues, expanding the comparison between other animals, quote, "Men, women, old, young, married and single were ranked with horses, sheep and swine. There were horses, men, cattle, and women, pigs, children, all holding the same rank in the scale of being, examination, and indelicate inspection," end quote. Douglass expressed envy, even when discussing animals' recognition over the slave, but he also admired them as creatures of the finest form and noblest blood. As we know, the question of interspecies relationship and the problems that arise around the Anthropocene and our ecological urgency are now an ever-growing philosophical and political presence and reality. They closely relate, I would argue, to Douglass's thinking. I think he was very much interested, of course, in the Quaker idea of living in harmony with nature, but he realized that the world is always imbued with human violence, no matter how civilized we claim to be. At the beginning of the film, Douglass remembers when he looked at a tree as a young boy and saw that there were Black human remains hanging there. This creates the relationship between nature, terror, and violence. It's a violence that the slaves have experienced throughout the centuries, and the violence that Black people still experience when being seen as non-equal entity compared to the non-human categories. Frederick Douglass' activism, his aesthetic theory, and art they inspired have a role, I'd argue, in establishing a new post-Enlightenment humanity. In the work, we are creating scenographic space where we can articulate different visual iterations and construct a place where one can establish, I hope, a more dialectical way of thinking about Douglass. Of course, this is all being aided by the new technologies. It would be, of course, impossible to make a 10-screen work in the way that we have if it wasn't for the sophisticated manner in which digital technologies have developed. One has to have, of course, a conceptual idea, but to achieve it both sonically and visually calls for certain programming, editorial skills that help us in what we are trying to articulate. In Lessons of the Hour, I hope that we have managed to create a sense of similarity, a simultaneous way in which one is viewing the work. One can't view in its entirety as one would in a single screen work, but one can get the kinetic scenographic flow of images. And I hope that creates a kind of poetics of attention. This way of making an exhibition relates to the ways of presenting contemporary political arguments, because we need to remember that we are also in a moment of a politics of distraction. We no longer look just with our own eyes, but with an iPhone too, which is connected to the new perverted politics of looking, a new non-neutral kind of visual vocabulary, which is being created, and one that is an indication of the questions connected to racial justice and the body politic. And here there's a work that I made in 1983 called Who Could Colin Roach, which is an installation piece now with the video, which in a sense was very much inspired by the making of Letters of the Hour. I turned back to my own archive and returned back to this early work, which was about racial injustice. We know that Douglass was at the forefront of this movement, and we now find our own bodies confronted with it as well, whether we like it or not. The positive looking at new technologies relate to Douglass's commitment to photography and his self-representation that was an inspiration in the construction of Lessons of the Hour. The question of what can be seen and who can be seen relates to the questions of indexicality, digitally reauthoring oneself, creating subjects of autonomy and authority of the disobedient, and in a sense, I would argue, demastering citizenship in the 21st century. Douglass was trying to right the wrongs through the technology of his times by repicturing himself against the pathological regimes of stereotypical and demeaning representations of African Americans. At the same time, his aesthetic philosophy on photography, which predates Walter Benjamin's work on photography by almost 70 years, recasts the idea of how important it is for the photographic medium and its digital equivalents can be created to rearticulate its practice towards an emancipatory aesthetics. These are images from when I did a work called Frederick Douglass Doppelganger, when it was presented in Piccadilly as a double screen work. It's like a public project. So I'm just, in a way, commenting on these many platforms of which one makes work so it can be communicated, as it were, to a public. So if we think about this question of the rearticulation of practice towards emancipatory aesthetic, it brings me the attention that it was an iPhone image of modern day lynching that created the current global response to Black Lives Matter in 2020. So I think this question of photography and its role of who takes the photograph is incredibly important. Last week, we presented the Lessons of the Hour publication at Gagosian Gallery in London, a project that I worked on for 2 years, which wasn't dissimilar from making the film. This book project once again reminded me of that even in the 21st century, Frederick Douglass' critique of racial oppression prophetically holds true. The fact that we are still living with this question indicates the weather, here I'm thinking of Christine Sharp, has not changed much. Moreover, we are currently living through 3 pandemics, ecologically, racially, and virally. While remembering the recent killings of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, Lessons of the Hour, the book, the film, bridge these events and use the artistic apparatus in order to regain agency, to critique the age of digital disinformation and the persistent trauma of slavery, which haunts the contemporary political discourses as a primal scene. Frederick Douglass's incredible skills as an orator and his reflections as a writer served as an inspiration during the making of this book, and I wish to use both filmmaking work, bookmaking work, 2 distinctive languages in order to create an artwork that will hopefully inspire others to learn more about Frederick Douglass, to delve into the poesy of his words and the aesthetics of his writing, both which make our life more bearable during these challenging times, and to engage with the politics that still require our commitment and struggle. I believe, as Douglass did, that aesthetics and politics have a pivotal role to play in the reconstitution of our subjectivities and our humanity. As he said in his speech, "What to the slave is the 4th of July given in 1852, quote, "We have to do with the past only as we can make it useful to the present and to the future, to all inspiring motives, to noble deeds, which can be gained from the past, we are welcome. But now is the time, the important time." Ever since my early work, in this case, the work here, Odak Rush, which I made in 1995, I resort back to the apparatus of camera photography as a vehicle that is a way to able to document certain struggles in a more immediate fashion. For example, my work on Rush Limbaugh, called That Rush, made in collaboration with Patricia Williams, the law professor, was a short visual essay from a 1995 work examining the phenomena of Rush Limbaugh TV from a series called Signal to Noise, Life with Television, a multiple part critical look at the beginnings of the Trumpian discourses networked through television and radio talk media, which were used as an orchestration tool of the Tea Party and the religious right, which we later would be mainstreamed by Trump and, dare I say, other politicians that you may be familiar with. How ironic that Trump thought that Douglass was still alive and doing a good job 2 years ago, and how ironic Limbaugh is now 6 feet under. One realizes that all the media apparatus and digital or otherwise are tools in the battleground that can be appropriated by the right or by the left for its own ends. So it's really important to have access to them and to be able to construct works contesting the dominant media regimes and how struggles are presented in them. This is why Douglass knew that he had to have access to the means of production through photography, print media, and art to articulate his citizenship. Film, photography, architecture are instructional forms that one can appropriate. And I think Douglass and Lina Babardi knew this very well. This has always been really important in relationship to the imaging of the crisis points. It is through the media apparatus of artworks which become a flashpoint for injustice, through the way it's disseminated, that we're able to see the emergence of a form of modern day communications and art. We can see how one images and who points a camera still matters and always will. Those intentions are important requirements for how communities and artists might organize themselves in the future in order to respond to certain events which could have, in some cases, terrible ramifications in unpredictable ways that only the future can foretell. In the end, I'm reminded of Shakespeare's Tempest, Shakespeare being an actual author that Douglass was very much inspired by, when he reminds us that what's past is prologue. And this also reminds me of a quote from Lina Babardi, who said that linear time is a Western invention. Time is not linear. It is a marvelous entanglement where at any moment, points can be chosen, solutions invented without beginning or end. Thank you very much.
Acho que eu estava falando no mudo, desculpa.
I was on mute, my apologies.
Obrigado, Isaac.
Thank you, Isaac. It's wonderful to hear you and to get to know Frederick Douglass' story better. I was doing some research these days about him and trying to dive deeper into his story. And one of the things that drew my attention is the fact that Douglass, for clear reasons, not just because he were fighting for abolition, he was also a very important man in articulating the pressure for women's vote. He had the clarity in his mind that social justice did not depend only to justice to one specific group, but a broad justice. He fought for values that united different causes and different groups. And I think that this is a very important learning, and it shows his integrity. And he brings this to us. As I heard you, I was thinking about some other personalities you've worked with, and I wanted to ask you, we still have some minutes, can you please comment about the relationship that you established or that you see, and also about your interest regarding these people? You've worked with a poet, you've worked with an activist and a sociologist, now with Lina Bobardi and Frederick Douglass. They are prominent figures in history, all of them. But I'm curious to understand the link between them. What do you see of similarities between them? And also, how do you choose who you want to investigate, promote, and share about?
Well, you know, I think you're absolutely right in relationship to the question of Douglass and his commitment to women and suffragette rights at his particular time, because his last speech before he died was a speech to the feminist and suffragette movement for Susan B. Anthony, the great suffragette, who basically was really someone that Douglass had lots of arguments with, but his commitment to women's rights was absolutely equal to a certain extent in relationship to his questions around humanity and slavery. And so I think that, you know, it's a very important point. And Douglass was also, in a way, an internationalist. He was someone who was very, I would say, cosmopolitan in terms of his approach in relationship to his work, and in relationship to, in a way, taking on a certain Enlightenment project, and in a way mastering those projects. I mean, his use of language as an orator, his interest in Shakespeare, all of these things are so, in a way, given a kind of equal value and weight in his work, and his brilliant work around photography, not just in terms of the fact that he was trying to rearticulate his subjectivity and his sense of humanity through photography, but also the fact that he actually wrote 4 lectures on photography, which constitute an aesthetic philosophy around photography and art. You know, this is literally kind of almost a century before Benjamin. So, I mean, there's really a lot of work, I think, to be done with Douglass and his achievements. And I think those sentiments are sentiments which are also connected to how I think about Lina Bobardi and the role that she played in relationship to rearticulating a Brazilian modernism through her relationship to both organic and Afro-Brazilian cultures. But I think at the same time, she was able, as an outsider, you could say, as someone who emigrated from Italy to Brazil, to, in a way, do that work of creating a space for the integration of both high and popular cultures, articulating them into new forms, and creating spaces which would be spaces of social engagement and social interaction, and at the same time have an interest in the language of architecture as well, as being at the forefront in terms of creating new ways of us appreciating art and, in a way, viewing art. You know, so I see Douglass and Inabadi as protagonists who are at the forefront of rewriting the rules of representation, both in art and its production and its distribution, to articulate new ways of looking and new ways of citizenship. And I think this sort of grasp that both these protagonists, you know, one from the 19th century, the other from the 20th, and the ways that they have able to, in, you know, demanding circumstances, Lina Abadi, one of the few women architects who was able to, in a way, create a number of different museum spaces, which are very much utilized to this very day. And someone like Douglass, whose work has come to be, I would say, at the forefront of our political thinking in terms of thinking about a post-Enlightenment humanity that takes on questions which he began in the 19th century. So I'm really attracted to these figures because I see them as powerful figures. You know, a Black man and a white woman who, in joining them, I think, of creating the possibility for new societies and new ways of both appreciating art, but also questioning, you know, in a sense, that questioning where questions need to be posed, I think. So, and I think, you know, they both were interested in aesthetics. You know, Douglass was a philosopher, actually, not just someone who was actively making images of himself, but actually writing, you know, and very much involved in lectures and education in the same way that Babadi was, very prolific and very concerned about those questions. So I think, you know, all of these for me are really important, you know, but they both had, I think, and I would argue, a very deep commitment to art and appreciating art, and are both involved in their different ways in making culture for us that we all need today.
Sim, me lembrei, inclusive, porque você...
Yes, and you were saying a Black man and a white woman. And Douglass, in the 19th century already, he was defending this alliance as a way to bring a more powerful fight for social justice. And it was quite a progressive thought at the time, you know, conciliating these questions, which could seem unconciliable at the time. I wanted to go back to photography. It's really fascinating. He, as a former slave, and he learned how to read and write by himself. He had the clarity about the importance of images, not just, as you mentioned, in defining his own identity or one's own identity and acknowledging oneself as an individual, but also as a political tool to have more social projection, to make ideas circulate more, so that he could, or his ideas could also travel and be reproduced just like photography. And as you were speaking, it occurred to me, well, we saw, at least in Brazil, that the right or the conservative field seems to somehow to be more ingenious in the way they use images, and more clever somehow in the way how they use images as a political force to convince people. Recently, we saw that the left maybe is lagging behind in their capacity to use these new technologies, these reproduction technologies, to state the values that they defend. And do you believe that Douglass has something to teach us about this right now at our current situation, our current moment? How do you see the role of images currently, and how the liberal or the progressive field, how could they better use images so that they can use this tool and this technology to spread their own ideas. It's really interesting when you showed your works divided into several screens and the idea of montage and addition. How do you build this as a tool for seduction and also something that can mobilize people for some values or ideas?
No, I completely agree. I think there's a way in which there is a real importance for us to be able to become, I think, a little bit more nuanced about the way that images are working today in society. I mean, of course, it goes, I think, without any question that the algorithmic aspect of technologies and how they are manipulating the way in which we as sort of subjects today react to news and information is in the grip of a propagandistic algorithmic technology, which is actually dominated by sort of media platforms where there is, in a sense, the space which has become flattened in terms of the possibility for rearticulations. But I think, nonetheless, there is the possibility for there to be a much more nuanced, richer way of understanding how those are circulated and how they exist. So, for example, at the end of Lessons of the Hour, I didn't want to use images that we're familiar with in 2015 around Black Lives Matter, because this work was made in 2019, so it's a year before what happened in 2020. Nonetheless, there was what, you know, Christine Sharp has spoken about in terms of the weather, you know, the kind of conditions politically that one was feeling, I think, created this situation. And of course, it's the technology, as I said, of the iPhone, which we now have as a perverted way of looking at the world, I would argue, as a tool that's part of our kind of cognition that created the response to Black Lives Matter, you know. And similarly, of course, it's the right that uses these media platforms to articulate its point of view. So I don't think those things are non-neutral, if you see what I mean, because they're platforms which are being, in a way, used, I think, yes, more by the right at this point in time. And I think it's interesting to think about that. But it's also interesting to think about the means of production and who controls those, who controls the apparatus. And I think that's why Douglass, with his family, I mean, his daughters worked until they were blind on the North Star newspaper and the Frederick Douglass newspaper, and distributed those papers themselves. So the means of communication, the means of the apparatus of the technologies themselves were important tools in the struggle for the fight against slavery and the possibility for creating the whole way in which there would be a sort of freedom movement, you know. So I think, you know, we know that these tools are really important, and I think in my works, what I'm trying to do with the use of multiple screen works is that, of course, you know, we're talking to ourselves and communicating on this platform. It has many screens. We're on Facebook, we're doing our emails. This is all part of our lingua franca. So in a way, that sort of way of working with screens seeps into artistic practice, into what a fantastic art historian, Jennifer Gonzalez, called the poetics of attention. You know, I'm interested in the poetics of attention that can be drawn from the correlation of different screens and what that gives us as a new way of thinking about time in the juxtaposition of Frederick Douglass from the 19th century and his speech when compared to the imagery of the 21st century, which is no longer just photographs. You know, they are drones utilizing, in a way, a technology of imaging a population. And we know that this drone imagery is also something that's used in wars. They're used as a way of predicting how you might, in a way, completely obliterate targets. So I do think that images sometimes offer these prophetic things, and sometimes they could be quite dark in a sense. So maybe I don't quite believe, in terms of what Douglas said in 19th century, that we can hold a photograph and look at it and let it speak for itself. You know, we know that images are contextualized now and manipulated and rearticulated, not always with the best intentions. So I think, you know, this is a shift, you know, and I think that my work and presentation of it alludes to that shift. And I want to create a certain critical way of looking when we are looking at art, because I believe that art has that role to play.
Isaac, infelizmente o nosso tempo está acabando.
Isaac, unfortunately, we are almost out of time. I had many other questions to ask you, and I would like to
Sorry, my questions have been too long-winded. My answers have been too long-winded.
Imagina, elas foram
No, the answers take the time they should take. That's how it is. It's just a very brief encounter, and I think we should meet more often and discuss more often. I really want to thank you, congratulate you on your work. Thank you for your time, for being here with us. I know that it's late in the UK now, and I wanted to invite everyone who's watching to keep on participating in the ZUM festival. Tomorrow we have a conversation about trans archives in Argentina. There's a very important archive organized by Maria Belen. And on Friday, we have another interesting conversation about iconoclasms and monuments. We're going to have a debate. And this is one of the questions I wanted to talk to you about, but it's thinking about the war of images and how we can use these icons or not use these icons in favor of the liberals, or, you know, or in favor of human rights and social justice. Isaac, once again, thank you very much. I wanted to thank everyone in the backstage who made this happen. I wanted to thank the interpreters, the language interpreter and the sign language interpreter. And we will have another panel tomorrow. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.